And the last two blending modes that we have in the inversion and cancellation section of blending modes are subtract and divide. Boop, boop, boop. And subtract and divide are very, very, very straightforward in that subtract simply subtracts the active layer from the background layer, and divide simply divides the background layer by the active layer. And this is, of course, on a pixel by pixel basis. But there's a reason you may not need to use these. In short, it goes like this. The modes are like inverted versions of other modes, and subtract and divide aren't layers that are affected differently by fill opacity than by opacity. So let me show you what I mean. Let me just cover one of our candies with this gradient and then set this to subtract. And you can see that the black subtracts nothing because 0 from anything is the original number, and white, which is 100% here, subtracts everything, so it just goes to black. Now if we were to reduce the fill opacity, it simply is the same as reducing the opacity. Now here's where things get interesting. Let me go ahead and pop open our other gradient over our other candy, and I'm going to set this one to linear burn. And linear burn. Here we go. Looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? Now let me invert the gradient. Let me show you what I'm doing here. Put it back on normal. Invert the gradient first with a quick Control I, which is the same thing as image adjustments invert. I just prefer Control I. Now let's set this to linear burn. Look, it's the same effect, except linear burn is one of the layers that's affected differently by fill opacity than by standard opacity, which means I can tone down the effect or I can make the effect more transparent. So let me show you the difference. Let me go ahead and tone down the effect. We'll just put this at around 80% or so. And let me go ahead and just drop the opacity essentially on the other one at around 80% or so. See how this has more of a vibrant calculation going on, whereas this one is just some now gray being put over everything else. So that's not to say that subtract doesn't have its place, it's just that its place is somewhat limited. More generally, you'll just want to invert the active layer that you were going to subtract and set it to linear burn instead so that you can take advantage of the fill opacity. So watch out for that one. Now that leaves divide, and guess what? Let me crank this opacity back up on both of these. I'm going to set this one to divide. Wow! As we get up to the black on the gradient, it goes to just this absolutely insane amount. As we get to the white, practically nothing happens. Because as we go to white, that's the equivalent of the standardized 1. Divide something by 1 and it's just the original number. And on the other side, well, if you divide by 0, then it's undefined, so it's just going to shoot up to some ridiculous amount. So it gets brighter and brighter the darker the gradient is on there. But guess what? This also is not one of those special layers affected differently by fill as by opacity, so it's just the same washed out effect. However, if we were to come to our inverted gradient, and instead of setting it to divide, we were to set it to color dodge. Color dodge. Doesn't this look familiar? It's essentially the same, except now fill opacity will affect it differently, which means we can lower the effect as it goes through. So, you know, general rule of thumb, if you're going to use subtract, just invert the active layer and instead do a linear burn. If you're going to do divide, just invert the active layer and go ahead and do a color dodge. You'll get the same effect, but you'll have much more control over everything. So that's all that there is to these strange inversion cancellation modes. So let's show them in action. Let me pop on over to, say, this model again. And here we have divide, and we have divide with just a low opacity. But with a high opacity, again, you can see that this is shockingly similar to color dodge. Let's switch it over to color dodge. but it is the invert. Let's go ahead and Control I. We're just going to invert our amber. Now Control I is non-destructive because it's going to simply flip the value of each pixel on the channel by channel basis. So flip it back and it's back to where it was. So that's it. That's all you're getting from divide. So frequently just, inverting it, and then you have full control over it using the fill opacity rather than just the opacity. So, you've got that one. But let's put it back to normal. Let me invert again. Boom. And let's toss it on to subtract. And here we have subtract. But again, if we were to pop this over from subtract to linear burn, and then invert linear burn, same deal. That's all that's going on there. So nothing too amazing. Let's reinvert this before I forget. And just for fun, pop on over our standard layer here, crank that fill back up to maximum. What happens if you divide something by itself? Well, every pixel is getting divided out by itself, so boom, you end up with pure white. Subtraction, well, everything's subtracting out, so boom, you end up with pure black. Well, there you have it. That's about it for those last two blending modes in our cancellation/inversion or inversion/cancellation section. That brings us down to our component modes, which is a pretty quick one to cover, and we'll do that in the next video. See you in a minute.